The silver locket, cold as a gravestone, warmed against her palm as a stranger's voice in the hallway sliced through the dusty quiet. The voice was a low, controlled baritone, utterly out of place in the musty little office that smelled of old paper and defeat. Eloise Cuthbert closed her fingers around the locket, the only thing of her mother's she had left. It was a habit, a touchstone when the world felt too thin. Right now, in this solicitor's office with its peeling green wallpaper and a single, fly-specked window, the world felt like it might tear open. She was here for a key. Not a metaphorical one. A real, heavy iron key to a house called Hawthorne Cottage, left to her by a great-aunt she'd met exactly once, at a funeral when she was 10. The great-aunt was a family ghost story, the one who'd gone peculiar and lived in shameful isolation. To Eloise, drowning in the loud, humiliating scandal of her father's financial ruin, peculiar and isolated sounded like a promise. It was an escape hatch, a place where the whispers of London society couldn't reach. Mr. Edgars, the solicitor, was a small man made of dust and coughs. He avoided her eyes, pushing papers across the desk with quick, bird-like movements. The property is unencumbered. The taxes are paid. It is yours, Miss Cuthbert. A fresh start. He said fresh start like it was a disease. He slid a large envelope toward her. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a blob of dark red wax. Across the front, in a spidery, old-fashioned hand, were the words, asterisk for her eyes only. Upon occupancy. Asterisk. A chill, unrelated to the locket, went through her. What is this? Mr. Edgars coughed again, a dry, papery sound. Her instructions. Explicit. You are not to open it until you are within the walls of Hawthorne Cottage. She was particular about her privacy. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a nervous pity that was worse than scorn. Sign here, and here. The key is inside the envelope. She signed. Her own name looked shaky on the document. As she picked up the envelope, it felt unnaturally heavy. The key inside shifted with a solid asterisk thunk star. This was it. The last normal moment. The last breath before the plunge into a quiet, obscure future. She stood, tucking the envelope under her arm, clutching the locket in her pocket. The fracture in this reality was so small, a hairline crack, the solicitor's trembling hands as he took the signed papers, the way he looked not at her, but at the closed office door, as if expecting someone. Good luck, Miss Cuthbert, he whispered, not meaning it. She stepped out of his office into the narrow, wood-panelled hallway. The air was cooler there, smelling of lemon polish and damp wool. The only sound was the slow, loud asterisk tick, tark, asterisk of a grandfather clock at the far end. It was a lonely, judgmental sound, marking time she was wasting. She needed to get to the coaching inn, to secure passage to Sussex, to disappear. She took 3 steps toward the front door, her boots soft on the runner. The clock gave one final, heavy asterisk tark asterisk that seemed to shake the floorboards. The smell hit her first. Not polish or dust. The crisp, clean scent of expensive bergamot cologne and starched linen, cutting through the stale air like a knife. Then, a shadow fell over her, blocking the thin light from the door's frosted glass. A man. He was tall, his shoulders broad in a dark, perfectly tailored coat. He hadn't been there a second ago. He moved with a quiet, sure grace that was more frightening than if he'd stomped. He didn't look at her face. His gaze was fixed on the cream-colored envelope under her arm. As he passed, his shoulder brushed hers. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, solid contact that shoved her slightly off balance, a shock of warmth and force. In that same, smooth motion, his hand, long-fingered, bare of gloves, shot out. He didn't grab her. He plucked the envelope from where she had it pinned against her side. The movement was so fast, so confident, she didn't even have time to gasp. He had it. He was 2 steps past her, the envelope now in his possession, his back to her. He stopped. He didn't turn around. His voice, that same low baritone she'd heard from the hallway, came back to her, quiet and final. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a statement, dropped into the quiet like a stone into a still pond. You shouldn't have come here, Miss Cuthbert. And then he was moving again, pushing open the front door. Cold, Damp London air rushed in. He stepped out into the grey drizzle and was gone. Eloise stood frozen. The shock was a physical thing, a jolt that locked her joints. Her palm, where the locket had been, was suddenly sweaty. The spot on her arm where his shoulder had touched hers burned. The hallway was empty again, silent except for the relentless asterisk tick, tark asterisk of the clock. The proof of her inheritance, her instructions, her key, gone. Stolen in broad daylight in a solicitor's office by a man who knew her name. Who was he? What was in that envelope that he would steal it so brazenly? The words asterisk upon occupancy asterisk echoed in her mind. She couldn't occupy a house without a key. She couldn't follow instructions she no longer had. The last normal moment was shattered. The hope of a quiet life had just been plucked from her grasp by a stranger in a well-cut coat. And the only thing she knew for certain was that her great-aunt's fresh start was nothing of the sort. It was a beginning, all right. But of what? The rain had turned to a fine, cold mist by the time Eloise stumbled out onto the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man in the dark coat was gone, swallowed by the maze of London lanes. For a long minute, she just stood there on the wet cobblestones, feeling the drizzle soak into her woolen shawl. Her mind was a blank page, shocked clean. Then, a hot spark of anger ignited in her chest. That envelope was hers. That key was her way out. He couldn't just take it. She didn't think. She just moved. Her cheap boots slipped on the slick stones as she broke into a run, heading in the direction he'd vanished. She dodged a coal cart, sidestepped a puddle of something foul, her eyes scanning every tall, dark-coated figure. But it was useless. He had vanished as completely as a ghost. Breathless and soaked, she finally stopped in the lee of a baker's shop, the warm smell of fresh bread a cruel contrast to the cold panic inside her. What did she do now? Go back to the solicitor? Mr. Edgars would probably just cough and look at the floor. She was alone. For 3 days, she lived in a fog of indecision. She used the last of her coins to stay in a grim little boarding house on Larkspur Lane, the room smelling of boiled cabbage and old dust. She thought about giving up, going back to her father's ashamed silence in his borrowed room. But the memory of that man's voice, asterisk, you shouldn't have come here, asterisk, was a challenge. It stuck in her head. On the morning of the 4th day, a Wednesday, she made a decision. She pawned her mother's silver locket. The pain of letting it go was a sharp, physical ache in her throat, but the coins it brought were freedom. She bought a ticket on the next public coach to Sussex. The journey was a jolting, cold affair. The coach rattled and swayed for hours, passing from the smoky outskirts of London into the rolling, green-grey countryside. She shared the space with a farmer's wife carrying a basket of chickens and an old man who snored. Eloise just stared out the window, watching the world blur by, wondering what on earth she was going to do when she got there. A house without a key. It was near dusk when the coachman dropped her at the end of a muddy lane. "Hawthorne Cottage down there, miss," he said, pointing with his whip. "Half a mile or so. Mind the ruts." He clucked at the horses and left her there, alone with her single carpet bag, in the deepening quiet of the country. The lane was more of a trench, thick with gloopy mud from the recent rains. Hedgerows, tangled and bare, rose high on either side. The only sounds were the squelch of her boots, the sigh of the wind, and the distant caw of a crow. It felt like walking to the end of the world. And then she saw it. A stone wall, crumbling in places. An iron gate, hanging off one hinge. And beyond it, Hawthorne Cottage. It wasn't a picture postcard cottage. It was a low, stubborn-looking house of grey stone, with a slate roof where moss grew in thick green patches. The garden was a wild sea of dead thistles and skeletal rose bushes. One chimney pot was cracked, but a thin curl of smoke rose from the other. Someone was there. Her pulse, which had slowed to a tired thump, kicked back into a gallop. She pushed the groaning gate aside and walked up the overgrown path, her eyes fixed on the front door. It was painted a faded blue, and there, sitting casually on the stone step as if he owned the place, was the man from the solicitor's office. Viscount Alistair Thorne. She didn't know his name yet, but he looked even more out of place here than he had in London. He was sitting on her step, his long legs stretched out, examining the cream-coloured envelope in his hands. The red seal was broken. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable in the twilight. He wasn't smiling. He just looked tired. And his knuckles, she noticed, were scraped raw and bruised, like he'd been in a fight. For a second, they just looked at each other. The anger she'd been carrying for days boiled over, clean and hot. Without a word, she dropped her carpet bag. Her eyes scanned the ground, landing on a heavy, leather-bound ledger book that had been left out in the weather, probably by some long-ago tradesman. She picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy, damp and solid in her hands. She didn't hesitate. She hurled it right at his head. He moved with that same infuriating speed, ducking to the side. The book thudded against the blue door with a sound like a gunshot and fell into the weeds. He stood up, slowly. "I suppose I deserve that," he said, his voice quiet. Eloise didn't answer. She was already moving past him, up the step, to the front door. The key was in the lock. He'd let himself in. She shoved the door open, the smell of closed-up air, old ash, and dust hitting her. She went straight for the fireplace. The poker there was long and iron, spotted with thick orange rust. She grabbed it, the rough metal biting into her palm, and turned to face him. He had followed her inside, filling the small, dark space of the parlor. She hefted the poker. It was terribly heavy, and her arm muscles shook with the effort of holding it level. But she held it. "Get out," she said. Her voice shook, too. He didn't advance. He just watched her, those sharp eyes taking in her trembling hands, her wild hair, the determined set of her jaw. He held up the envelope. "I read it," he said. "I had to. And then I had to discourage the man who followed me from London to try and take it from me. Hence the knuckles." He gestured with his injured hand. "My name is Alistair Thorne, and we need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about. You stole from me. Now leave my house." She adjusted her grip on the poker. It felt like it was slipping. "It's not that simple," he said. He took a careful step further into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your great-aunt, Amelia Cuthbert, she wasn't just a reclusive old woman. She was a keeper of secrets, for a very dangerous group of men. This," he tapped the envelope, "isn't about property deeds. It's a set of instructions written in a personal code. A code hidden, I believe, inside something she left for you." The locket. The thought came to her instantly. The locket she had just pawned in London. A cold dread began to mix with her anger. "What do you want with it?" she demanded. "My older brother, Robert, was accused of her murder," Thorne said, the words flat and heavy. "He was found with her, you see. She was dead. He was holding a letter opener. They called it a crime of passion, said he was a secret lover, that they'd argued. He's in a prison in Dover, awaiting transport to a penal colony. He didn't do it. But the only person who can prove what really happened in this house is your aunt, and she's dead. This code, whatever it leads to, is the only thing that might clear his name." Murder. The word hung in the dusty air. Her great-aunt hadn't died of a weak heart. She'd been killed. And this man, this intruding, arrogant Viscount, thought the answer was here. In her asterisk inheritance. "And you think I have it?" she whispered. "I know you do," he said. "And more importantly, so do the men who really killed her. They think Amelia passed her knowledge on to her heir. To you. They've been watching the solicitor's office for weeks. That's why I was there. Not to frighten you, but to get to the information first. To keep it from asterisk them star." The world seemed to tilt. The dusty parlor, the rusted poker in her hand, the tired, bruised man in front of her, it all reorganized itself into a terrifying new picture. She wasn't just an heiress to a scandal. She was a target in a game she didn't understand. The heavy poker suddenly felt useless, a childish weapon against something so shadowy and vast. Her arm dropped, the point of the iron clinking against the stone hearth. She looked from his earnest, grim face to the broken envelope in his hand. Her escape had vanished. Her quiet life was gone before it started. In its place was this, a crumbling house, a vicious secret, and a man who wouldn't leave. Her first, irreversible choice was made the moment she didn't run from the cottage, the moment she listened. She was in it now. "We are both targets, it seems," he said softly, echoing her own terrifying realization. Outside, through the grimy window, the last of the daylight faded. Inside the house, the only light came from the low fire he'd built. And in the corner, an old grandfather clock, its case scarred and its face dusty, stood silent. Its hands were frozen at 4:17, a forever reminder of a moment that had happened here, in this room, that had broken countless lives. Eloise looked at the stopped clock, then back at Thorne. She had come for a hiding place. Instead, she'd walked into the very center of the storm. The silence in Hawthorne Cottage was a heavy, living thing. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of held breath, of waiting. For a week, Eloise and the Viscount existed in a strange, tense dance within the creaking walls of the old house. He had insisted on staying. "They know you're here now," he'd said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Leaving you alone would be like signing a death warrant." So he took the small, damp bedroom at the back of the house, and she stayed in the slightly larger one upstairs, the one that must have been her aunt's. Their days fell into a strained rhythm. Thorne, or Alistair as he'd quietly ask her to call him within these walls, spent hours poring over her aunt's papers, old ledgers, gardening journals, bundles of personal letters. He was looking for the code. The key to the cipher, he believed, was in the missing locket. Eloise, feeling like a ghost in her own life, busied herself with practicalities. She cleaned. She tried to tame the wild kitchen garden, her hands growing raw from pulling weeds. She cooked simple meals on the ancient stove, and they ate them in near silence at the small kitchen table, the only sounds the scraping of forks on plates and the wind whistling through gaps in the window frames. He told her more about his brother, Robert. Not the accused murderer, but the boy who'd taught him to fish, the young man who'd been hopelessly, quietly in love with a woman far above his station, a love everyone said was impossible. He'd been meeting Amelia Cuthbert here, yes, but as a friend, a confidant. He was the one person she'd trusted outside of her secret work. "He found her," Alistair said one evening, his voice rough. He was supposed to meet her that afternoon. He walked in and found her on the floor. He picked up the letter opener, stupid with shock, just as the magistrate's men arrived. It was too perfect. He was framed. Eloise listened, and the story became real. It wasn't a scandal in a newspaper anymore. It was a good man, rotting in a cold cell, and a clever, lonely woman betrayed in her own home. The fear became real, too. 2 nights after she arrived, a sound jerked her from a thin sleep. Not the house settling. A sharp snap from the garden, like a stepped-on twig. She lay frozen, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. Downstairs, she heard the soft creak of floorboards. Alistair was awake, moving. She heard the front door open and close with barely a whisper. She waited, clutching her blanket, for what felt like an hour. Then the door clicked shut again, and his footsteps came back up the stairs. He paused outside her door. "Just a fox," his low voice came through the wood. "But bolt your door, Eloise." She did. Every night after that. The mirror moment came on the 8th night. It had been a day of frustration. A cold spring rain lashed against the windows for hours. Alistair had hit another dead end in the journals. The atmosphere in the cottage was thick with helplessness. Eloise had gone to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. She finally got up, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, and went to the window. The rain had stopped. A weak, watery moon had broken through the clouds, casting the overgrown garden in shades of silver and black. She looked out, but she didn't see the garden. She saw her own reflection in the dark glass, a pale, blurred face framed by messy hair, eyes wide and shadowed. She looked like a stranger, like one of the ghost stories they told about her aunt. And in that moment, she saw herself clearly. She wasn't the brave heiress, or the clever solver of mysteries. She was a runaway. She had come to Hawthorne Cottage not to claim an inheritance, but to hide from her father's shame, from the whispers of London. She was using her aunt's tragedy, and Alistair's mission, as a distraction from the wreckage of her own life. She was burying herself in a dead woman's war because she was too afraid to face her own quiet battle. The person in the window wasn't a heroine. She was a scared woman, hiding in a haunted house, letting a man she barely knew fight a shadow enemy for her. The realization was a hollow ache in her stomach. It was the darkest point, the void. She had a choice to make. A real, impossible choice. She could give Alistair the final piece. She remembered, with a sickening lurch, that the locket had a tiny catch inside it, a hidden compartment she'd discovered as a child. She'd never thought anything of it. That must be where the cipher was. She could tell him she'd pawned it at Bennett's pawnbrokers on Larkspur Lane in London. He could go and get it. He could take the cipher, solve the code, find Amelia's hidden proof, and clear his brother's name. And she could stay here, safe in her chosen exile, anonymous and alone. It was what she'd wanted from the very beginning. Or she could go with him. She could face the journey back to London, the danger, the relentless pull of the scandal she'd fled. She could step out of the shadows and into the heart of the conspiracy, not as a bystander, but as a participant. It meant admitting her life before mattered. It meant fighting for a future, not just hiding from the past. The frost on the windowpane had begun to form delicate, feathery patterns as the night grew colder, marking the slow, inevitable creep toward morning and decision. She watched one crystalline tendril grow, reaching across the glass like a question. Downstairs, the old grandfather clock, which Alistair had somehow gotten working again, chimed once for the half-hour. Its sound was no longer a stuck, silent judgment. It was a marker of time moving forward, time they were running out of. She heard a floorboard creak on the landing. Alistair was awake too, probably staring at the same moon, wrestling with his own demons. She thought of his bruised knuckles, the tired set of his shoulders, the unwavering belief in his brother. He was a rock in this chaos, but he was alone in it. She had let him carry all the weight. The face in the window stared back at her, and this time, Eloise didn't look away from her own eyes. A slow, steady warmth began to push back the hollow ache. It wasn't bravery, not exactly. It was something simpler, the refusal to be a ghost in her own story any longer. She turned from the window, her shawl pulling tight around her. She walked to her bedroom door, unbolted it, and stepped out onto the landing. Alistair was standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the faint moonlight from the hall window below. He turned, a question in his posture. She didn't offer him the easy way out. She didn't give him the pawnshop location and send him into an uncertain fate alone. She met his gaze in the near darkness, her voice clear and quiet, leaving no room for doubt. "I am not a damsel," she said. The words hung between them, a promise and a declaration. And in that moment, Eloise realized the anonymous solitude she had hoped for was a lie, a prison of her own making. The only way out of this nightmare, for his brother, for her aunt's memory, and for her own future, was not around the danger, but straight through the heart of it. The quiet life was gone. It was time to fight for a real one. Something shifted in the cottage after that night. The air wasn't just tense with waiting anymore. It was charged with purpose. At breakfast the next morning, a simple meal of porridge and strong tea, Eloise didn't wait for Alistair to speak. She looked across the rough wooden table and said, "The locket. My mother's. It had a hidden compartment inside, behind the little portrait. A tiny spring latch. I found it when I was 12. Alistair put his spoon down slowly. "Where is it?" "Bennett's pawnbrokers. On Larkspur Lane, in London. I sold it for the coach fare here." She felt a flush of shame, but pushed past it. "That's where the cipher must be." He nodded, his expression serious. "Then we need to go back." He said "we" without a hint of question. It was settled. But Eloise held up a hand. "Wait. Before we go chasing to London, we've been thinking like detectives, looking for complex codes in the journals. But what if my aunt thought like a person hiding something in plain sight? She was a woman living alone, fearing discovery. She wouldn't leave a map that required a special lens or chemicals to read. She'd leave a clue only someone who understood her daily life could see. She got up and gathered all of her aunt's personal journals, not the ledgers for her secret work, but the small, cloth-bound diaries about the garden, the weather, visits from the vicar. She spread them out on the parlour floor. Alistair knelt beside her, watching, a curious light in his eyes. For 2 days, while a late March wind howled outside, they worked. Eloise read every mundane entry aloud. Planted the lavender by the blue door. Mr. Higgs from the village fixed the chipped step on the blue door. The paint is peeling on the blue door again. Must see to it before winter. She stopped, her finger resting on the page. The blue door, she said softly. Alistair frowned. The front door is blue. Faded, but blue. But she mentions it constantly. As a landmark. Planted the lavender asterisk by asterisk the blue door. Not by the front door. It's specific. What if it's not asterisk this asterisk blue door? They went outside into the blustery afternoon. The faded blue front door stared back at them. Eloise walked around the side of the cottage, through the tangled weeds. There was no other blue door. She stood in the overgrown kitchen garden, feeling the cold wind bite her cheeks, and looked toward the village. The church spire was just visible over the trees. And she remembered an entry from 2 years prior, took the old willow basket to the chapel, left it for the poor box. That blue door needs a stronger hinge. Her heart gave a little jump. The village chapel, she said, turning to Alistair who had followed her. She mentions taking things to the chapel. And she mentions asterisk that asterisk blue door, too. Without another word, they set off down the muddy lane toward the village of Hawthorne Cross. It was a mile's walk, the wind pushing at their backs. The tiny stone chapel sat at the edge of the village green, ancient and sturdy. And there, on the side of the building leading down to the old crypt entrance, was a door. It was small, stout, and painted a surprisingly bright, forget-me-not blue, though the paint was heavily chipped and worn. "This is it," Eloise whispered, certainty coursing through her. "This is her landmark." The door was locked. Alistair, with a glance around the deserted green, took a small, multi-tool from his pocket. "A useful skill from a misspent youth," he murmured with a faint smile. After a minute of careful work, there was a solid asterisk click star. He pushed the door open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that drifted up was cold and carried the smell of damp stone, old earth, and something else, a faint, metallic tang. Alistair lit the small lantern they'd brought. "Stay behind me," he said. "No," Eloise said, her voice firm. She took the lantern from his hand. "I decoded the clue. I lead." The fear was still there, a fluttering in her throat, but it was outweighed by a new, solid feeling of ownership. This was her aunt's legacy. Her fight, too. She went down first, the rough stone walls closing in around them. The crypt was a low-ceilinged space, filled with the shadows of old tombs and memorial slabs. Their breath fogged in the lantern light. They searched for nearly an hour, growing colder and more desperate. Then, Eloise's light fell on a plain, modest tombstone in the corner. The name was weathered away, but carved at the base was a simple, deep-cut symbol, a hawthorn branch. Her aunt's name. Hawthorne Cottage. She ran her fingers over the carving. One of the stone berries seemed looser than the others. She pressed it. With a gritty rasp, a small section of the tomb's base slid open, revealing a dark cavity. Inside was a metal strongbox, about the size of a large book, dull and covered in a fine grey dust. Alistair let out a long, slow breath. "You found it." As he reached for the box, a new voice cut through the silent crypt, smooth and out of place. "I'll take that, if you don't mind." They spun around. Coming down the crypt stairs was Mr. Edgars's clerk, the quiet man with the ink-stained fingers who had always hovered in the background. His name was Jeremy Finch. He wasn't smiling. In his hand was a heavy, leather-covered cosh. And he wasn't alone. A hulking, silent man followed him down. "You've been very clever, Miss Cuthbert," Finch said, his eyes on the strongbox. "But not quite clever enough. We've been watching the pawnbrokers in London for weeks. When your Viscount friend here made such a show of retrieving a certain locket yesterday, we knew you were getting close. We simply followed you from the cottage." Alistair moved instantly, stepping in front of Eloise and the open tomb. "It's over, Finch. The evidence is here. Amelia documented everything. The names, the payments, your whole filthy operation." Evidence in a box is no evidence at all if the people who found it met with a tragic accident in a damp crypt, Finch said, his voice cold. A falling stone, perhaps. Very sad. The bigger man started forward. Alistair shifted into a fighter stance, but Eloise saw it, Finch's other hand dipping into his coat. Moonlight from the stairwell glinted on something slender and sharp. A knife. He wasn't aiming for Alistair's front. He was angling for a quick, brutal strike to the side as his accomplice charged. Time seemed to slow. Shouting would do no good. Throwing the lantern would plunge them into darkness and likely start a fire. Her eyes darted around the crypt, searching for anything, any tool. They landed on the old, rusted iron ring set into a nearby stone slab, a handle used long ago to help move the heavy covers. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. As the large man lunged at Alistair, she dropped the lantern. It didn't go out. It rolled, casting crazy, spinning shadows. She grabbed the iron ring with both hands. It was freezing and rough, solid as a tree root. She braced her foot against the slab and pulled with all her strength, not to lift it, but to twist and yank it out of its setting. It came free with a shocking, grating screech of stone on metal. It was heavier than she imagined, a solid arc of crude iron. She didn't swing it at the man. She couldn't lift it that high. Instead, she held it like a discus, low and hard, across the stone floor. It skidded and spun directly into the path of the charging man. His boot caught on it with a terrible, bone-jarring crack star. He cried out, stumbling forward, his momentum broken as he crashed to his knees. In that second of distraction, Alistair was on him. But Finch was smarter. He saw his chance. With his accomplice down, he darted forward, not toward Alistair, but straight for the open tomb and the strongbox. His eyes were wide and greedy. "The locket," he snarled, his polite clerk's mask completely gone. "Throw it here. Now." He thought the cipher was still in the locket. He didn't understand the real treasure was already in his reach. His hand closed around the handle of the strongbox. The single candle in their lantern, still burning on its side, suddenly guttered. The flame shrank to a tiny blue bead, then flared again. For 3 terrifying heartbeats, the crypt was plunged into near total darkness. In that black instant, Eloise heard a scramble, a grunt of effort, and the sound of metal scraping on stone. Then the lantern flame steadied, painting the scene anew. Alistair was standing over the larger man, who was now groaning on the floor. Jeremy Finch was still by the tomb, but he was frozen, staring. The strongbox was gone. In its place, sitting innocently on the dusty stone, was the silver locket, its chain coiled like a tiny, shining snake. Alistair had switched them in the dark. The box was now tucked securely under his own arm, hidden by his coat. Finch's face twisted in rage and confusion. He snatched up the locket, fumbling with the catch. He pried it open, finding the hidden compartment empty. He looked from the useless trinket in his hand to Alistair's calm face, to Eloise standing her ground by the tomb. He understood he'd been outplayed. The sound of raised voices and running feet came from the stairwell above. The vicar, a tall man with a kind, worried face, and 2 burly farmers from the green appeared, carrying stout sticks. "We heard a commotion," the vicar called out. "Is everything, good heavens?" Seeing the authorities, even local ones, was enough for Finch. With a last, venomous look, he dropped the locket, turned, and shoved past the vicar, fleeing up the stairs and into the twilight, his accomplice scrambling to follow. The crypt was suddenly very crowded, and very loud with questions. But Eloise barely heard them. She walked over to where the locket had fallen. She picked it up, the metal warm from Finch's grip. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the familiar shape, the tiny scratch from the crypt floor that hadn't been there before. Then she looked at Alistair. He met her gaze, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and patted the side of his coat where the strongbox was hidden. They had done it. They had the proof. The confrontation was over. But as the vicar led them back up into the cool evening air, Eloise knew the real work, the work of clearing a name and securing a future, was just beginning. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of that work. She was ready for it. The first snow of December began to fall just as Eloise was stoking the fire. She watched from the window of Hawthorne Cottage as the flakes, fat and slow, drifted past the glass and settled on the mended garden wall. They dusted the bare branches of the hawthorn tree and began to soften the edges of the world outside into quiet, clean white. Inside, the parlour was warm, golden with firelight and the soft glow from 2 oil lamps. The smell was different now: beeswax polish, dried lavender from the summer garden, and the rich, simple scent of a beef stew simmering in the kitchen. 8 months. It felt like a lifetime, and it felt like the blink of an eye. So much had happened since that cold, drizzly day in the solicitor's office. The strong barks from the crypt had contained everything Amelia Cuthbert had promised: ledgers of names, dates of clandestine meetings, and letters that painted a clear picture of a political blackmail ring operating out of London's financial district. Jeremy Finch had been a small but vital cog, using the solicitor's office to identify vulnerable targets. The most damning piece was a letter, in Finch's own hand, detailing the plan to frame Robert Thorne for Amelia's murder after she'd threatened to expose them. It hadn't been an easy process. There were long, tense days giving statements to magistrates. There were journeys to Dover, where they met Robert Thorne, a man with his brother's eyes, but softer, wearier, carrying the ghost of a year in a prison cell. The day the judge declared the conviction unsafe and Robert walked free into the weak autumn sunlight, Alastair hadn't said a word. He'd just gripped his brother's shoulder so tightly his knuckles went white, and Robert had rested his forehead against his brother's for a long, quiet moment. Eloise had stood a few steps away, a witness to a private, hard-won peace. Afterwards, there were choices to be made. Robert needed time and quiet to heal, choosing to stay for a while at the family's smaller estate in the Lake District, far from memories and whispers. Alastair, however, kept coming back to Sussex. At first, it was to tie up loose ends with the property. Then it was to help repair the garden wall that had been crumbling for a decade. Then it was to install new locks on the windows, and to patch the part of the roof that had started leaking during an October storm. Eloise, in turn, had stopped being just a custodian of a haunted house. She had become its steward. She'd used a small portion of her now secure inheritance to hire help from the village. Mr. Higgs came back to properly fix the front step, and a young woman named Bess helped with the deep cleaning. Slowly, room by room, the cottage lost its feeling of dusty sadness. It became simply a house, one that bore its scars but was sound. She heard the back door open and close, a stamp of boots on the mat, and the rustle of a heavy coat being hung up. Alastair entered the parlour, bringing a gust of cold, fresh air that made the fire flutter. His cheeks were flushed from the winter chill, and there were snowflakes melting in his dark hair. He wasn't the imposing, unreadable Viscount anymore. He was just Alastair, here in her kitchen more often than not, a familiar and steady presence. "It's really coming down out there," he said, crossing to stand by the hearth, holding his hands out to the warmth. "I saw," Eloise said, replacing the iron poker in its stand. She didn't need it as a weapon anymore. Now it was just a tool for tending the flame. She nodded to a stack of papers on the small table by the window. "Those came for you. From your London man of business." He walked over and picked up the top document, his eyes scanning it. A slow, easy smile touched his lips. "It's finished," he said, his voice thick with relief. "The final dispensation. Robert's name is officially, completely clear. All properties restored. It's over." He brought the papers and laid them on the mantelpiece. They came to rest right beside the silver locket. Eloise had redeemed it from Bennett's pawnbrokers the very week after the crypt. It sat there now, not hidden in a pocket or clutched in fear, but out in the open. The firelight danced on its surface, catching the fine, hairline scratch it had earned on the crypt floor, a permanent memory of the night everything changed. Alastair's hand, now warm from the fire, reached out and covered hers where it rested on the back of a chair. His palm was calloused from the work he'd done around the cottage, a tangible record of the time that had passed. His thumb brushed over the new scar on the inside of her wrist, a thin, white line from the night she'd wrenched the iron ring from its setting. It was a badge of a choice, of action, not a mark of victimhood. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand under his so their palms met, feeling the solid, real warmth of him. She looked from the locket to the papers, symbols of 2 battles fought and won, and then to the window, where the snow was painting the world new. "The clock is working again," he said quietly, following her gaze. She looked at the old grandfather clock in the corner. Its polished oak case glowed. Its pendulum swung with a steady, comforting asterisk tick-tock, tick-tock star. No longer stuck at a terrible moment, it now measured the peaceful, ordinary passage of hours in a safe house. He didn't ask to stay. He didn't make grand promises about the future. He simply stood with her, watching the snow fall in the deepening twilight, their joined hands a quiet understanding between them. The silence was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the crackle of the fire and the ticking clock. The scandal she had inherited hadn't been a curse in the end. It had been a key, a brutal, difficult key that had unlocked a door she never knew was there. It had led her away from a life of hiding and toward a life of purpose. It had brought her to this place, this solid stone cottage that was now a home. It had introduced her to a man who saw her not as a damsel to be rescued, but as a partner to stand beside. Outside, the world was being covered in a blanket of white, a fresh start offered by the season itself. Inside, the light held firm against the descending dark. Eloise gave his hand a gentle squeeze, then let go to pick up the stew ladle. There was ordinary, good work to be done. There was a meal to share. There was a fire to keep burning. She looked over her shoulder at him, at the man who wouldn't leave her side and whom she now couldn't imagine being without. "It's about ready," she said, a simple statement about supper that meant so much more. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I'm starved." And in that simple exchange, in the warmth of the kitchen and the quiet fall of snow, Eloise Cuthbert knew the weight was finally gone. In its place was something lighter, stronger, and entirely her own, a future built not on running away, but on what she had chosen to fight for and who she had chosen to stand with. The story hadn't ended with the closing of a case. It was just beginning, one peaceful, ticking moment at a time.